Welcome to Psych 102, Physiological Psychology. This is the textbook for the class, and this is chapter 1, and I'm about to review it right now. Here we go. How can a 3-pound mass of jelly that you can hold in your palm imagine angels, contemplate the meaning of infinity, and even question its own place in the cosmos? Especially awe-inspiring is the fact that any single brain, including yours, is made up of atoms that were forged in the hearts of countless far-flung stars billions of years ago. These particles drifted for eons and light years until gravity and change brought them together here now. These atoms now form a conglomerate in your brain that can not only ponder the very stars that gave it birth, but can also think about its own ability to think and wonder about its own ability to wonder. With the arrival of humans, says V.S. Ramachandra, it has been said the universe has suddenly become conscious of itself. This truly is the greatest mystery of all. The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons, says Francis Crick. Philosophical zombie in the philosophy of mind and perception is a hypothetical being that from the outside is indistinguishable from a normal human being, but lacks conscious experience, qualia, or sentience. For example, if a philosophical zombie was poked with a sharp object, would not feel any pain sensation, yet could behave exactly as if it does feel pain. It may say, ouch, recoil from the stimulus, and say, it is feeling pain. Question for the class and discussion: can we reduce consciousness to the physical parts in the brain? What about the subjective experience of what it's like to be you? Can that be reduced to the physical parts of the brain and the neurons firing, for example? Try the zombie experiment. What if an exact physical copy of you were made down to every single neuron? Slightly different, actually, this question than the zombie experiment. Would it be you? Would something be missing a subjective you? So some might argue with the zombie experiment that there is a subjective you missing, that scientists in the future made a copy of you, but it doesn't fully encapsulate you. Counter to that argument, you can say, well, your assumptions are based on that we cannot make another copy in this futuristic world that actually has conscious experience, qualia, embedded in that copy. In other words, does the conscious experience or the subjective experience of what it's like to be you exist in the brain? It's a question that I posed to my daughter, who is in 3rd grade. And we've been talking about, what your brain is and, what it does. And she says, well, of course it exists in the brain. Where else does it exist? In your ear? In your toe? In your thumb? Okay, good point there. Good point, kid. Who are you? Said the caterpillar. This was not an encouraging opening for a conversation. Alice replied rather shyly, I hardly know, sir. Just at present, at least I know who I was when I got up this morning. But I think I must have been changed. I must have changed several times since then. Once upon a time, I dreamt I was a butterfly. Suddenly, I awoke and came to myself. Now, am I the man who dreamt I was a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming I'm a man? Shang Tzu. While we tend to conceive the operations of the mind as unified and transparent, they're actually chaotic and opaque. There's no invisible boss in the brain, no central meaner, no unitary self in command of our activities and utterances. There's no internal spectator of a Cartesian theater in our heads. to applaud the march of consciousness across its stage. The mind is kind of a theater where several perceptions successfully make their appearance, pass, repass, glide away, and mingle in an infinite variety of postures and situations. What is consciousness, says the famous neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, from moment to moment. It's like a pipe organ. One note plays, and that is what you're conscious about. Things play on and off constantly, yet it appears like it's unified. Consciousness is not a thing in the brain where information gets poured into it and you're aware of it. It's a constant struggle of all these circuits in the brain competing for the top, to hold the stage, if it were, for that second. Feel like there should be like, and I think to myself, all those images, what a wonderful world. Okay, I can picture the earth there. Ancient Egyptians believed that the Nile flooded every year because of Isis' tears of sorrow for her dead husband Osiris. The river was a thou, a being, rather than a physical object to be studied empirically. The rumbling of an earthquake in the mountains was still an angry god to the Greeks. They came along 1,500 years later and started to say, not thou, but it. Something like the Nile was an object that could be studied scientifically. Along with this change in thinking came two foundational ideas that eventually led to the origin of not only behavioral neuroscience, but the field of psychology, epistemology, and the mind-body problem. Epistemology is the theory of knowledge. Plato and Aristotle argued different points about the theory of knowledge. Plato argued that the mind is born with innate ideas. As we know it today, especially, and there's research to show that the brain is born with the innate ability to understand math, to couple things and see things into groups in terms of a perceptual experience. The capability of a rational mind is what he talked about. In developmental psych, talk about innate physics and biology, and that knowledge of that. Knowledge that two objects can't pass through one another, for example, and what a living thing is, and those types of things. Aristotle, on the other hand, argued that all knowledge begins with the senses, and really, in many ways, this was the beginning of empiricism. Mind-body problem. Where does the mind come from? Does it arise from brain activity? These were the ideas or questions that occupied the minds of philosophers in the Greek and Roman era. There's some of them there: Stratus, Herophilus, Galen, and Vesalius. They all said yes. Mind arose from the study, or it arose from the study of the body, and that mind is derived from brain activity. And you can see some of the illustrations that Vesalius was doing. Descartes came along and talked about epistemology also, and his idea of rationalism. Reason is the chief source and test of knowledge rather than experience through the senses. And thus, the mind-body problem was continued to be discussed. There was one idea of dualism where the mind, soul, and the body are separate. So the idea is that there's this mind that is probably a spirit or something like that, and it is in your body, but it's not your body. Yet you see with Descartes, he said that he didn't fully embrace dualism, it would seem. And he sort of looked at things in a mechanistic hydraulic model and added information about the pineal gland. So really people were trying to incorporate science and different people to different degrees. Then you also have the challenge of the church, who would, lop your head off or throw you off the tower or something like that. If you had views that were separate than the church, and certainly saying that from a materialistic, monistic point of view, that the mind derives from brain activity might be something that might get your head lopped off. So perhaps he wanted to keep his head, but yet jump into the materialistic, monistic point of view. In any case, he said that the mind, soul, and body are separate yet intertwined. Pineal gland was the seat of the soul and the place from where all thoughts originate. Nerves were hollow tubes where animal spirits flowed and produced movements, sensations, memories. These hollow tubes and the idea of a mechanistic hydraulic model was big during this time. And as we'll see with the Vaucanson duck, very similarly, this idea of a mechanistic world that can be figured out and studied. Continuing with epistemology, empiricism, all knowledge is derived from sense experience and observation. You had John Locke, who said the mind's a tabula rasa, mind's a blank slate to write down knowledge, learn from sense experience, and there's no innate ideas. And the famous David Hume, one of the best, in my views, minds of that time and most interesting philosophers. Mind-body problem also there was an opposing view of dualism, which was materialistic monism. I mentioned that in the previous slide, where the definition of that, of course, is that mind is not separate from brain. Mind activity derives from brain activity. Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan, as you see right over here, famous for that. Pierre Gassendi, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, all these people, including formerly Descartes, were having all these arguments and great discussions in France and Paris about these different ideas and philosophies. Luigi Galvani in the late 1700s did the frog experiment that the book talks about, was able to get a dead frog's muscle leg to twitch using electricity, as you can see the slide down here that shows that a woodcut. Then, of course, there was Vaucanson's duck, an example of the extent which Europe in the 18th century became fascinated with the idea that life might be dependent on not on some mysterious vitalizing subject or spiritual principle, but on purely mechanical processes. Go ahead and click this video and you can see a replica of Vaucanson's duck, but quite amazing for the time, the 1700s, where, you know, they're using fire right here, and that makes the duck's heartbeat, and I believe it even has lungs, and then it defecates at the end. Voltaire said, without duck of Vaucanson, you would have nothing to remind you of the glory of France. Hermann von Helmholtz came along, electrical brain, built off working showing that nerves operated by electricity, but demonstrated that conduction in the brain was much slower than wires. Important establishing biological nature of neural communication, and that neural function is open to scientific study, not based on some type of spiritual principle. So again, you can kind of see all these things as the basis in empiricism, materialistic monism, and sort of moving towards studying the brain and the development of neuroscience. Idea of localizations, that specific areas of the brain carry out specific functions, was advanced certainly when scientists studied Phineas Gage. As you can see right here, poor Phineas Gage got a bar shoved from an accident, industrial accident, some type of explosive, shoved the bar up through his face and then out his skull. It took out a big part of his prefrontal cortex. And then they studied the changes that occurred in Phineas Gage afterwards, and found that, of course, the area that got taken out was responsible for certain behaviors, such as planning and social behaviors. There's also Paul Broca, and you may know this from Broca's area, where he did an autopsy of brain where the person lost the ability to speak, and he found the damage to the area in the left frontal lobe, inferior frontal gyrus, which he named Broca's area, is responsible for production of speech. Phrenology by Franz Gall had the idea that different faculties are located in precise areas of the brain, and there's a phrenologist's map of the brain. Equipotentiality, on the other hand, looked at the brain as functioning as an undifferentiated whole. That's sort of formed the basis for the idea later that, yeah, there's localization, but also, oh, I have a future slide, there's localization, but there's also the idea of connectivity and the connectome and stuff like that, that the brain doesn't work in isolation either. Wilhelm Wundt founded the first psych lab in Leipzig, Germany. And so that's what I was mentioning. The current research shows the brain exhibits both localization and the distribution of function. And that's what you can see right here. Some of the localization, Broca's area, movement from the motor cortex and vision, occipital lobe, language, Wernicke's area, body sensations, the sensory motor cortex. These areas responsible for specific functions. But then as you can see here from the connectome, that the brain is connected to multiple parts, or multiple parts of the brain, multiple areas of the brain are connected to each other and speak to one another and function. The functions are sometimes distributed across different areas. What is neuroscience? Quite fascinating. It's an interdisciplinary science. You can see different disciplines there and what it does. Cellular, functional, behavioral, evolutionary, computational, molecular, cellular, and medical aspects of the nervous system. So you're studying the nervous system using a bunch of different disciplines to study that. Behavioral neuroscience specifically is a branch of psychology that studies the relationships between behavior and the body, particularly the brain. Questions they ask neuroscientists. How does the brain's activity result in consciousness? What changes in the brain when a person learns? How do we recognize the face of a friend? So the book then goes into nature versus nurture and nurture, interactional nurture question. How important are environmental influences? That would be nurture in shaping behavior. An increasing number of behaviors are turning out to have some degree of hereditary influence also, and that would be nature. Address the confusion. Take a look at these really cool videos. I'm not going to click on them, but take a pause right here in the video and take a look at these very informative videos on DNA, genes, chromosomes, and also what the heck with DNA and how does that work in terms of translating that into production of proteins, which influence anything from your structure to your psychological experiences in some ways, to or your predisposition towards developing certain medical disorders or psychological disorders. And fascinating in some ways that the current medicine is taking a look at how to intervene with that process, whether it be from changing actual DNA code with CRISPR and stuff like that, or RNAi, which is RNA interference, where scientists are using methods to interfere with the production of protein. So if DNA, you have some faulty code, or it's been methylated somehow in your DNA, and it's sending out bad messages to the RNA, or the sort of carriers out of the messages from the DNA, then you can intervene in that process. And instead of actually changing the DNA code, you can do the RNA interference and basically quiet or silence the disease. And many different companies are doing that. It's sort of become famous with Moderna and with the Pfizer, BioNTech COVID vaccines, but also Aran Pharmaceuticals is doing some stuff in that area. It's been an area of my research. What are cells? Basic building blocks of all living things. Human cells are too tiny to see with the naked eye, but your body is made up of about 30 trillion of them. Your cells work together to make your body work. You have hundreds of different kinds of cells in the body, each specially adapted to do different jobs. For example, red blood cells carry the oxygen you breathe around your body. What are genes? Our genes are an instruction manual for your body. Hidden inside almost every cell of your body is a molecule called DNA. A gene is a short section of DNA. Your genes contain instructions that tell your cells to make organic compounds called proteins. Proteins perform various functions: antibody, enzyme, structure of your body, transport, etc. Keep you healthy. Each gene carries instructions that determine your features, such as eye color, hair color, and height. There are different versions of genes for each feature. For example, one version, a variant of the gene for eye color, contains instructions for blue eyes, or another for brown eyes. What are genes made of? A gene is a short section of DNA. DNA is made up of millions of small chemicals called bases. Chemicals come in 4 types: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. A gene is a section of DNA made up of sequence of A's, T's, C's, and G's. Human genes vary in size from a few hundred bases. Now, human genes, a few hundred bases to over 1 million bases per gene. Your entire sequence of genes and bases is called your genome. Take a look at DNA, and you see the structure of DNA here on the side. It's a chemical compound, nucleic acid, that contains genetic instructions needed to develop and direct the activities of every organism. DNA molecules are made up of 2 twisting paired strands. Each strand is made of 4 nitrogenous based chemical units called nucleotide bases: carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. They are the basis. Of course, we're, most of us made up of carbon. Such a good molecule, very flexible. They are, and again, the adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. Bases on opposite strands pair specifically. So you'll always see an A with a T and a C with a G. The double helix shape forms a structure similar to a ladder, where the bases form the steps of the ladder, while sugar and phosphate molecules form the sides of the ladder. The order or sequence of these bases determines what biological instructions are contained in a strand of DNA. Complete DNA instruction book or genome for a human contains about 3 billion bases and about 20,000 genes on 23 pairs of chromosomes. Humans differ in the sequences of nucleotides that make up your DNA only by about 0.5%. Tell that to the Democrats and Republicans. Majority of your DNA resides in your chromosomes, some in mitochondria. Chromosomes are found inside the nucleus of each cell of your body. Small amount is also found in mitochondria. Every single body cell in your body has 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. Every single sex cell, male sperm, female ova, has 23 chromosomes. Not 46, 23. The sperm enters the ova in fertilization. The chromosomes of the 2 cells merge to restore the number to 46. The 22 pairs, as you can see down here, this figure 1.8, are termed autosomes. And the one pair, number 23, that determines your sex are aptly called sex chromosomes, as you can see right here. And XX creates the genotype for a female baby, and XY creates the genotype for a male baby. As you can see, they look the same, the chromosomes, right? They mirror each other, except for the X and the Y. The Y is much shorter than the X. What are chromosomes made of? One DNA molecule and protein. DNA is tightly packed into chromatin, chromosomes so tightly packed that if it was stretched out, it would equal 6 feet in length. Wow. Single length of DNA is wrapped many times around lots of proteins called histones to form structures called nucleosomes. These nucleosomes then coil up tightly to create chromatin loops. The chromatin loops are then wrapped around each other to make a full chromosome. And just looking at, this is a slide that's not contained in your book, but just sort of marveling at the different chromosomes that you have in your body and how some can contain more genes than others. Chromosome 1 contains over 3,000 genes and over 240 million base pairs. And you can see chromosome 21 contains over 400 genes and 40 million base pairs. And some areas where different disorders have been identified with being associated with these genes. Because of all but 2 chromosomes are paired, most genes are as well, except the shorter Y chromosome has only 1/25 as many genes as the X chromosome. While these paired genes have the same type of function, their effects often differ. These different versions of the gene are called alleles. For example, allele for blood type. In some cases, you'll be blending. So let's take a look. Type B parent genes are B and O. We've got the Barack Obama genes. And then type A parent genes are A and O. Is that kind of like Elon Musk's child, AO? Something like that. I don't know. But anyway, so let's take a look at when they combine and make a baby. 4 different outcomes. In some cases, they can blend, as you can see right here. A and B become type AB. In some cases, you'll find the baby comes out, and it will be where the dominant allele rules. A plus O will equal A. B plus O will equal B, as you can see here, type A and type B. And some cases mean that some cases the baby will come out that way. But what you have to remember is that a dominant plus a recessive, always the dominant phenotype will result. So dominant, the whole reason why they call it dominant, obviously, is because it dominates over the recessive. When will the phenotype, which is the actual structure that you see, you got genotype, which is genetic code, and phenotype, which is the actual structure. When will the recessive gene be expressed in its phenotype? The recessive allele gets expressed with a 0 plus a 0. So there must be 2 recessive genes. And in other words, they must be homozygous. So you can see that here, that the only time they would get a baby with type O is when both of their recessive genes are expressed. Homozygous alleles are matched. Heterozygous alleles are different. Genotype, genes. Phenotype, the observable characteristics. There are X-linked traits. Some traits are on the X chromosome, but not on the Y chromosome. Influences expression of recessive traits in males, for example. Why? Well, males get only 1 X chromosome from the mom. Remember, males have an X and a Y. So they don't have another X chromosome with a dominant allele, for example, that can dominate the recessive gene. As such, the recessive allele from the mom is expressed. This is why males are 8 times more likely to be red-green colorblind, as it is a recessive allele on the X chromosome. And I do not know what number that is right there. It looks like 21 or 81. but you can obviously see that I've got some red green colorblind. Traits are determined by a single pair of alleles, such as blood type or Huntington's disease, are really rare. Most traits are what they call polygenic traits, those determined by multiple genes. They're much more common, for example, hyperintelligence, skin color, sight disorders. And it's important just to remember that genes do not provide a script for behavior, they control the production of proteins. So 2005, human genome. 21,000 genes are protein encoding, 3%, and 97% of the DNA is non-protein encoding. Used to be thought of as junk DNA, not thought to control the expression of other genes, for example, or that is the translation of their encoded information into the production of proteins. It's heredity, destiny, or predisposition. Sexual reproduction increases variability in offspring. It does not create clones. Children share only half their genes with each of their parents or with each other. A sex cell receives a random half of parents' chromosomes as a result. A parent can produce 8 million different combinations of chromosomes at uncertainty as to which sperm and egg will unite. A number of genetic combinations that can be passed on to offspring rises to 60 or 70 trillion. Inheritance of genes is not the only factor that determines phenotypic outcomes. Genes can be turned on or off based on development and experiences, or their activity can be upregulated or downregulated. Genes produce more or less proteins or different proteins at different times. Large number of genes change their functioning at different times in life. Also, you can see Alzheimer's, genes related to aging, and then schizophrenia. The study of epigenetics is quite fascinating. It studies the changes in organisms caused by the modification of gene expression rather than alteration of the genetic code itself. Gene functioning based on which genes are expressed changes from experience. So literally the turning off and on of genes and the expression of genes changes from your experience. And so that's not just the nature and nurture, that's seriously nature versus nurture. That's nature and nurture combining and interacting in a serious way. These ways are called, some of the things that they found are labeled DNA methylation, histone acetylation, and mRNA. And the frightening thing and interesting thing in many ways, I should say interesting and sometimes frightening, is that this can be passed on to future generations. Research has shown this can be passed on, like dietary habits, like obesity can be passed on to future generations through not just genetic code, but we're talking about methylation. So one's diet throughout their life, if one ate an unhealthy diet, they can pass on the effects of that to their offspring. PTSD has shown, unhealed PTSD, if you will, can be passed on to offspring, and all kinds of things. So interesting area of study, epigenetics. Oh, and there's a link you can check out on epigenetics. Heritability is a percentage of variation in a characteristic that can be attributed to genetics. It can be calculated by comparing concordance rates for twins. If one twin has a trait or a disorder, does the other twin? So you have to remember that identical twins share 100% of their genes. They develop from the same fertilized egg. Fraternal twins, rather, share about 50% of their genes. And they develop from two separate fertilized eggs, but of course they share the same womb, which of course we know prenatal influences can have an influence on brain development, sexual development, stuff like that too. Heritability for intelligence is around 50%, which means that half the population's differences in intelligence are due to heredity. Schizophrenia has a 60 to 90% heritability. And as you can see right here, the twin studies of behavioral medical disorders and the concordance rates And you can see that the concordance rates of behavioral disorders tends to be higher than medical disorders. If one twin has it, the other twin has it, that would be concordance. And of course, the interaction vulnerability model, more genes per disorder reduces the threshold to produce it. Today, most scientists reject the nature versus nurture concept. And that is the chapter 1.